we had a review, a look at the second bank of the United States of America. Now, I don't want there to be any confusion about the involvement of the second bank of the United States. It was really an extension of the first bank of the United States. So that the first bank of the United States, which was chartered for 20 years, that is from 1791 and extended to 1811. Now, the principal core reason for the creation of the bank was America in its infancy and as an evolving democracy. And somebody in the late 1800s who wanted, late 1700s, who wanted to become a world presence, that is, the new country of America, wanted to become a significant trade partner in the new world, needed credit. That is, the ability of America to buy and sell on the global markets. Let's keep in mind that at that time there were great traders in England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Middle East, and the Far East. When we talk about the Far East, we talk about China. Silk, primarily. But certainly in the European theater and that of England, we look at tea and clothing products that would be imported into the United States. So the need of a trade facility with financial stability was required, and that gave the foundation for the creation of the Bank of the United States. So we talk about the creation of the second bank, but really there was one bank of the United States. So the creation of the second bank was merely an extension of the first bank, chartered in 1791. Now, one of the things that was part of that involvement was the relationship of the various states, that is, the 13 original colonies. We talked about those states, and their expectation, that is, their relativity within their individual spheres of a need for a national bank. Now, if we look at the Northeastern States, we can talk about New Hampshire, New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, which were primarily, New Jersey, which were primarily industrial states. That is, that the income of those individual states, or the employment base, if you will, for those individual states, was based in industry. By way of example, shipbuilding in New York and New Jersey, which were on the eastern seaboard, that is, contiguous to the Atlantic Ocean, required heavy capital formation in order to facilitate the manufacturing, design, and growth of the shipping industry. Large capital formation. So, as we look at the creation of the bank, its assets, that is the lending of money and the financial stability within that area, that is the northeastern United States, was of paramount importance to those large manufacturing concerns. So we talk about regional or sectional interests. The northeastern United States in industry, but the southern states, as we cross into the South, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, those states primarily had an interest in what? What? Agriculture. Of which the primary staple was what? You just said it. Cotton. Cotton. Today I have a cotton shirt on. Cotton is a wonderful fabric. When woven into make a shirt, it is warm in the winter, feels warm in the winter, yet cool in the summer. So cotton had a great value in terms of its export potential. Sending cotton out of the southeastern United States and over to Europe. But the planters that did that did not require, that is, in the plantations of the South, southeastern United States, or the southern states, even those bordering the eastern seaboard, which would be North Carolina, South Carolina, did not anticipate the same required capital infusion that the northeastern United States required. So, the southern states came into conflict with the creation of the bank. And we know that as part of the creation of the bank, there was a requirement for an excise tax on liquor. Liquor, alcohol, would be a non-necessary product. That is, it's not like bringing in oil or steel or wheat or cotton. Alcohol was determined to be a leisure or pleasure consumption product. So the government would tax it, the importation of it, primarily from Great Britain, wines from France, etc. And the South, that felt that was necessary, Southerners, you know, are planters of cotton and tobacco, and saw alcohol as a necessity and a product that they cherished more than the North. So there was opposition by the southern states against the bank. And so we went through what we call a ratification process. That is, that the individual states would be required to pass and validate the creation of the second bank of the United States. Does everybody see how that came about? And finally, when they got enough states to ratify, the bank came into existence and became a foundation of stability within the new creation of the United States. Does everybody see? Does anybody have any questions on that up to this point? Okay, because I know, Anissa, you were not here Friday, and I wanted to make sure you understood that. Okay?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, all right. So now, coming forward to today's lecture, we are looking at corporations, the creation of corporations, the value of corporations, the structure of corporations, and the further evolvement or creation of labor unions. Now, corporations are entities into themselves. They are structures that primarily evolved from they were created by state charters. So they were governmentally chartered by a given state. And today, they are still controlled in great process or created through state creation. That is, giving a corporate registration or state registration for the existence of a corporation. That is, listing its officers and directors and being held accountable under the laws of the various states wherein they are chartered. So let's give an example of that. Some states, New Jersey, New York, created corporations. New Jersey, at the time, became one of the most friendly. That is, the willingness to create corporations with friendly restrictions. Keep in mind that a corporation, as it is developed, takes on a life of its own. That is, that its survivorship, its ability to survive beyond its creators is significant. Let me give you an example of that. If Anissa and Saba and I create a company, and let's call it the ABC Company, Corporation, ABC Corporation, with shareholders, officers, and directors. We anticipate the involvement of that and the life cycle of that corporation to be greater than our individual lives. So that we may die in another 50 years, but that corporation would have a continuing value to its shareholders. That is, that the life of the corporation is greater than the founding principles, shareholders. And that is of significant importance. We also know that corporate liability is minimal. Now, what do we mean by that? Corporate liability is the maximum. I'm trying to think of how to put this in a definable quote or a definable moment so that you will remember it. Corporations absorb liability away from its creators. Let's give an example of that. If the ABC Corporation that we created was in the shipping business, that is, shipping products and goods from America to England in ships. And in that process of shipping, through the negligence of the company that owns the ships. Water leaks in and damages the goods that are being shipped. Let's say it is cotton. Well, or better still, tobacco. And the tobacco or cotton is damaged by the water seepage into the ship. The corporation itself would absorb the liability for the leakage. And if there was an action, a legal action sought by the shipping people, that is the people that were shipping the cotton or tobacco out of the country, that action would be against the corporation, that is the ABC Shipping Company, and not the owners. Does everybody see the distinction there for corporate structure and the value of corporate structure? There were significant corporations formed back in the early 19th century that did great trading in the new founded country of America. The East India Corporation, which did a lot of importing of tea, silk, and the Hudson Bay Company, which shipped commodities into America and out of America on their ships and or wagons that would move products and commodities within the new continent. So those are examples of very active, very engaged corporations and how they move product and commodities within the world market. And you can see readily with the movement of those kind of assets, that is, it could be lumber that is milled in America and sold to Spain or Italy, that any consequential damage to that product in shipping could be absorbed. The liability, that is, for the damage could be absorbed by the corporations and not the shareholders. So, a corporation has its primary duty to shareholders. And does everybody understand the relationship of shareholders to the corporate structure? That is, the company would issue so many shares of stock. That is individual ownership within the company, so that the ABC Corporation that we form may sell shares and have shareholders to whom the company is accountable. Now, any corporate structure has what we call officers and directors. Have you all in your legal education had any exposure to corporate law at all?
No.
Okay. Well, I don't want to go too deeply into that because there's differences, I would think, within the country of Georgia and America in the corporate structures, but basically the principle is the same. So that officers and directors are charged with the responsibility of running a corporation. And they are accountable, that is, they are responsible to the shareholders who own the corporation. Now, the corporation, that is the shareholders, could very well be some of the officers of the company and directors. There is not a conflict for directors and officers to own limited shares within the company. Does everybody understand that and see that concept? Now, as corporations evolved in the 19th century, that is, there was great commercial activities we talked about last week that came in the New World and really started to find its creation becoming more prevalent as we get further into the 19th century, that is, the early 1800s. And from that, we start to see the development of what we call trade unions. Now, let's talk a little bit about the distinction between corporations and trade unions. Now, corporations are in the business, contrary to what many people will tell you, they are in the business of making money. That is, shareholders invest in corporations so that they may reap dividends, that is, profits, in accordance with the wellness, that is, the profitability of the corporation. And from that, wealth is created. So that the corporation that we had talked about forming, the ABC Corporation, which we have discussed in our scenario, we have said that it was in the shipping business. So now we started off with 2 ships going to the old world, taking lumber, cotton, tobacco, and other products or commodities from the New World in America. Now, over a period of time, and it could be 10, 15, 20 years, we see that we have grown to 25 ships. Some of them are wind-powered ships, and some of them we've started to see the development of steam power. And now the shareholders in the company are realizing great profits. Well, the truth of the matter is that many times where there is profit, there is greed. And so the shareholders want to make more profit, yet the people who are doing the work in the docks and serving as sailors, seamen, merchant seamen on the ships are being paid at an hourly rate. Now what happens is you start to see conflict between the shareholders and the management of the company, that is the officers and directors, and the seamen. Low wages, poor working conditions, long hours, etc., etc. So they come together in a collective format and form what we call labor unions. That is trade groups, and let's just, by way of example, and unfortunately I don't know what seaman would be called, but let's call it the Seamen's Association of America, just by way of example. So these steamships and wind sailing ships now have a union that they must deal with, and the union takes on collective bargaining rights. That comes more into the 20th century, and that will be a topic for discussion in the fall when I do part 2 of American legal history. But for right now, the unions find themselves in a position of dealing from strength when they collectively bargain, and that's a term I'm just grasping. I want to wait and use that in the next part of the course, but for the rights of the seamen. That is to say that the Seamen's Association is saying, you folks are making all the profit and we're doing all the work. Well, that's not entirely true. It sounds good though, because the seamen are being paid a wage and they have no, what's the word we're looking for, that differentiates between shareholders, directors and officers, and labor. There is no exposure to risk, financial risk, where you work for a corporation. The corporation, the entity of the corporation itself, absorbs the financial risk. If the company does poorly and can't pay its shareholders, or goes broke, goes insolvent, becomes insolvent, then that loss must be absorbed by the shareholders and not by the seamen. Does everybody see that? So the issue of risk is not being absorbed by the laborers, that is, the men who would work on the ships. But they have a right to be paid a decent living wage. And so their position is, against the corporations, unless you pay us the wage that we want, that is an hourly or daily wage. And in many instances, we see in Massachusetts in the early 1800s, out of New Bedford, Massachusetts primarily, and the areas of communities that are attached directly to the sea in Massachusetts area, where there were great whaling ventures, whaling corporations. We had ships that were owned by shareholders that would typically have a captain who would bring on seamen, and they would go out and kill whales, which were in abundance in that northeast corridor in New York and Massachusetts. And of course the whale, the oil was used for lamps and other commercial ventures. Now, many times those seamen, that is those that were in the whaling industry, were paid as a percentage of the profits of the shipping company. That is, the greater the profit of the hunt for whales, then a percentage of that was paid to the seamen as a profit for their labor. Do you see that? Does everybody understand that? Any questions about that? Okay. So, now we see the development of corporations and labor unions, the involvement of labor unions, and the setting of the stage, if you will, for legal conflict. Now, let's talk just a little bit about that. Lawsuits, certainly Saba understands this, and some of you that are a little further along with your studies understand how a lawsuit evolves, and we talked about that the other day. Plaintiff, that is the person bringing the legal action, and the defendant. And so we now see the opportunity, because you have two strong entities, the development and creation of corporations and the consequential evolvement and growth of labor unions, and the potential conflict between those two creations. Now, what is that conflict relative to or related to? Anytime you have large corporations, and one of the areas we see really start to develop in America is the creation of oil. That is not just oil coming out of the ground, but the refinement of oil for use in industry, homes, and the Standard Oil Corporation was founded by John D. Rockefeller and became a huge multinational corporation over time, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, and from that, great wealth was created not just for Mr. Rockefeller, but for the shareholders. So as we see that wealth created, then we look at people that we would refer to as working class people in America, saying, well, what is in it for me? Again, I would urge you to go back and consider the proposition of risk. That is, that the people who created the corporation, the shareholders, the officers and the directors, would absorb the risk factor as opposed to the labor unions. But that labor unions have the right to a decent and fair working wage, whether that's hourly or daily, weekly, or as a percentage of the profits, and to safe working conditions. Does everybody see that? Any questions up to this point? So as we move forward in this process, we are going to see the development of laws pertinent to labor unions, collective bargaining, hourly wages, wage and hour regulations, and that will come up in the presentation of the fall. Okay? Do you see that? So I don't want to get into that right now. Now, we have a few minutes left before the end of the class, and I want to go back. We have 2 regular classes left, and I want to go back and make sure that we review where we've been and start getting you prepared for the exam, the final exam on Thursday. So that's the end of my